Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Phil Snow Show. I've been absent recently, kind of like most of us, digesting what's going on in our country and trying to come to some reasonable conclusions and observations. Most of my observations, some of them, many, are similar with a number of things that are conversations that are taking place nationwide. And then there's a number of them that I think we're failing to address some of the obvious issues that need to be discussed. Um, it seems a little bit difficult to engage in some of these discussions because so many people are emotionally engaged. They're in a state of denial, state of dismissal, and we're in what I would consider confusing times for many people. The excuse me. A lot of the conversations that are taking place make me realize that there's a serious amount of education we need to do. That everybody's looking at things from their particular vantage point, and their vantage point is revealing that they have given very little thought to much of what's going on outside of their committed perspective. Um, so we all have a role to play. It's actually, I still see this as an excellent opportunity. I'm very hopeful by what I see going on in the country and actually worldwide as a response to the latest killing of an unarmed, unthreatening black man by police forces. And there's actually a few things that we need to discuss here. Part of it, which is obviously the long history of racism in America and the dismissal of it by many Americans, the justification of it, and the failure to come to grips with this reality. It's been pretty interesting to watch the response and the justifications that people are using to once again dismiss the reality of life in America for many of our fellow citizens. The riots that have ensued, the some of the destruction of property and the looting has become the replacement story. People don't want to continue to look at the reality and face, as I mentioned, the history that has led us to this present day, the wound that has never been treated, the trauma that has been inflicted upon our fellow citizens continues to manifest itself. And rather than deal with it, we want to displace the responsibility onto something else. Um, so I've had a number of conversations or exchanges, if you will, on social media, and it's been really heartbreaking to see the responses and how quickly people who initially supported an action to be taken, and to be fair, they continue to support that actions need to be taken against the inequity that exists with the treatment of law enforcement, particularly against African Americans. However, as they were quickly led off that and onto a rant about the looting that and the destruction of property that's taken place. I haven't seen all that much destruction of property. I saw the burning of the police station in Minneapolis. And my response to that is, I don't care all that much about it, to be quite honest. Buildings are easily repaired, they're easily rebuilt. And had we paid attention to the many, many previous cries for help within the African American to address this situation, it wouldn't have reached the point where they feel that a police station needs to be burned in order to get the attention of the country. Isn't that sad? That the sense of desperation has to reach that level. And then when it does, rather than be concerned with the desperation which caused this, we want to criticize. Absolutely absurd to me. As I mentioned, buildings can easily rebuild. Lost lives cannot be regained. And that's what's happening. And what we're seeing now is manifestation of decades upon decades of failure to deal with our racist past, our structural racism in this nation, and the impact that it's having on the people that it's used against. So I brought up what I considered relevant points, and that is, the concern for property and the concern for, looting. But I didn't see mentioned from anyone the concern for the property of the past. Because that's what we call African Americans, right? They were property. Property owned by white Americans. Property, not human beings. They were to be bought and sold and used as the owner wished. And if you wanted to whip one of them to death, he could do it. It was his property. Where's the expression of concern for that property? In the land of the all men are created equal. You think that hypocrisy can stand and that we should be okay with it? Are you kidding me? And let's talk about looting. What about the looting of the lands of this country from the Native American peoples? And the responses I received were, humanity has been abusing one another since day one, and wars have taken place, and people have conquered others and taken land, and so on and so forth. All true, all true. Do we use that to justify our behavior now? We're going to use that to ignore the unjustifiable, the treatment of blacks in America. I don't think we can. And of course, there were other responses from people who are of color, who expressed how they faced racism every day of their lives. I don't think they understand what racism means. I think what they meant to say was they expressed prejudice every day of their lives. However, racism and prejudice are two different things. Prejudice is a dislike or even a hatred for another person or another thing. It doesn't have to be a human being. You can be prejudiced against any number of things. And you can experience prejudice. Racism, however, is the ability to impose and affect the lives of others based upon your prejudice. And this particular person that was going on about the racism that they've experienced had a name that reflected the name of his heritage. His name wasn't changed to Jones or Smith or any other name of the owners of his family. His family was able to come here from another country willingly, not brought over chained up on a ship. They may have faced prejudice when they reached these shores, and they did. They worked hard and they established themselves. They were allowed to speak the language, the native language from which the lands from which they came. They were allowed to read, to educate themselves. If they were found reading or writing, they weren't whipped to death or nearly to death. They were allowed to have children and grow their family without their children being sold off for free labor. Were they? So let's talk about these things. Let's talk about the inevitable result of ignoring it. And let's, for God's sake, finally address the issue that needs to be addressed in this country. It's our failure to address it that's eating the inside out of this nation. The hypocrisy is astounding. The inability to face our past. And miss me again with, I was never a slave. Or excuse me, you were never a slave, and I never owned slaves. What do we have to do with that? Yes, it's true. You may never have owned slaves. And the black people in your life may have never been slaves. It doesn't dismiss the racism that has continued to affect them, the generational trauma that has been imposed upon them. Stop for a moment and consider these things. We have, as white people, no business, absolutely no business, telling black people how it feels to be black, or what racism is, or how you have experienced some type of prejudice. That's not our role. Our role is to come to grips with what white people in the generations that preceded us did to the black people of this nation, as well as others, Native American Indians, Mexicans, and many others. Not to the degree. I don't think, in spite of all the different prejudice, I don't think you can't make a comparison what was done to the African Americans. Let's finally deal with this. Let's acknowledge this past. Let's quit trying to sweep it under the rug. Let's quit trying to pretend that we addressed it. We haven't addressed it. If we'd addressed it, then this type of behavior would no longer be continuing. If we had addressed it, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. We have a lot to atone for. We have a lot to repent for. And although we can't repent for the sins that we personally didn't commit, we can acknowledge them. We can extend an apology and an understanding and compassion for what people went through. Rather than criticizing the descendants of victims, why don't we look at them with some understanding, compassion, and recognize the damage that has been done? You know, we send someone off to war, Iraq as an example. Guy or girl sees horrendous things. They're there 2, 3, maybe even 4 years. Maybe they're only there 1 year. But what they see is horrendous. What they experience is horrendous. When they return, they're a little bit off kilter, maybe a lot off kilter. And what do we say? You know, they're suffering from PTSD. We fail to actually address and help them in any significant way, but that's another topic. I'm not going to deal with that right now. What I want to focus on is the fact that we recognize that they're suffering from a trauma, from the things that they've seen, from the killing and the injuries, perhaps physical and emotional, that are experiencing. We're willing to recognize that they're damaged. They're wounded human beings. And yet, we don't want to recognize the damage and the infliction of pain and the trauma that's happened to our fellow citizens, our African American citizens, that has gone on for decades and generations. Either we're completely heartless, or we're, what I hope is actually more accurate, we're ignorant. I think the problem primarily is ignorance. And I think we're driven by, perhaps, in some cases, guilt, in some cases, just the immensity of dealing with the subject and the emotional sensitivities around it. We just prefer to keep it off at a distance rather than to examine it. But it's no longer that time. We've ignored this for far too long. The generations that preceded us failed to deal with it. And as a result, we've continued to watch people suffer. That time is over. Let's educate one another. Let's learn about what the reality has been for lives, black lives in this country. Let's quit attacking and criticizing and dismissing and start reflecting on the inequities that are happening right before our very eyes, the disparities that are taking place. It's time. And as an optimist, and I am ultimately an optimist, I'm a little angry right now, but what I'm seeing is perhaps the best possibility for change that I've seen in my lifetime. And I'm someone who was born in early 60s. So even though I was a kid, I didn't understand a lot of what I saw, but I grew up in California. My family's from Oakland, California. So that was kind of the heartbeat of a lot of social movement. And I feel more hopeful now than I've ever felt that we can actually gain traction and move things forward in a serious manner, where we can finally, at long last, attend to the wound that we're suffering from and put this sickening devil of racism behind us, flush it out of our lives, and apply the principles that we profess as a nation and that we have failed to implement again and again. There's a lot more to go into here. We're going to take it one step at a time. I expect this conversation to continue. I want input, but I won't tolerate foolishness. I know what my message is going to be rejected by many. I know it's going to be accepted by many. I know there's a lot of people that are, in spite of their frustrations, their fears, their anxiety, that they're willing to put their foot in and do some work. And I expect you all to come around. And for those who want to remain willingly ignorant, who want to stay in a state of denial, festering your own miserable perspectives in life, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the people who recognize there's injustice that's been done, that we can, should, and will be better people. And that we have to have some compassion towards one another. We have to provide examples, and that we have the capacity to do so. Just because we've made these mistakes, just because we've done wrong, doesn't mean we can't rectify it. doesn't mean we can't improve. So let's roll up our sleeves. Let's put in the work. Let's get to know one another. Really get to know one another. Let's find out what the issues are and let's address them. We can no longer be apathetic and unengaged in this regard. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. Expect more in the future. We're going to go into many segments of this in an examination of how and why we got to where we're at. I think we should have some vibrant discussions, and we'll work together. That's the point. So long for now. We'll see you next time.